A reading from Isaiah. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest, until her vindication shines out like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch. The nations shall see your vindication, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate. But you shall be called, My delight is in her, and your land married. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your builder marry you, and as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Please stand as you are able for the reading of the gospel. From the book of John. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, They have no wine. And Jesus said to her, Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, Do whatever he tells you. Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, Fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. On this Martin Luther King birthday weekend, I want to begin with a passage from the last chapter of the last book Dr. King wrote, the book titled, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? He recalled the Washington Irving story of Rip Van Winkle. Do you remember it? Right? So Rip Van Winkle fell asleep for 20 years on a New York mountain. And what confused him most when he awoke was the sign that had changed on the little inn in the town on the Hudson River. When he fell asleep, there was a picture of King George III. And 20 years later, when he showed back up, there was a picture on the same inn of George Washington. King said that the most striking thing about the story is not that Rip slept for 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution that would change the course of human history. And then he said this, every society has its protectors of the status quo and its fraternities of indifference, who are notorious for sleeping through revolutions. I want you to imagine with me this morning how different history might have been if the church hadn't slept through one revolution after another. What if we had been awake to what God was up to in the world and cast a vision for it instead of trying to protect the status quo? To that end, our text today, remarkably, from Isaiah and John, call us to this spiritual vision to wake up. Let me state it this way. The God of the Bible has a bias toward the last. You know, Jesus said again and again, the last shall be first. And the whole Bible is the story of the last being redeemed at last. Now, most of the time in our churches, we have proclaimed this to individuals. Your sin doesn't have the last word about you. God does. Don't focus on what's lost because God sees what's left. When you have lost a job or a marriage or a reputation, don't give up because God hasn't given up on you. God holds the future and grants eternal life to all who believe. Now that'll preach, don't you know? And if that's the word you need to hear today, let the Spirit speak. We're glad you came. But the personal salvation is not the whole story of the Bible. There's more. And I'm just grateful to be in a church with the spiritual maturity to know it and hear it. There are two senses of last I want to hold up to you today from our texts. Last, in the sense of those who have been left out, pushed down, and cast aside, as if inclusion in the gospel story matters as little to God as it seems to the world. And last, in the sense of who gets the last word on what things will look like when God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. The Bible is biased toward the last in both of these senses. And if the church wants to represent God to the world, this must be our bias too. So for that to happen, Christians need to have a sanctified, spiritual, this worldly imagination. Instead of starting with what is and figuring out how to justify it as the will of God, we must start out with the promises of God of what will be, and then begin to work with God to bring them to pass. The motivational speaker William Arthur Ward said, if you can imagine it, you can achieve it. If you can dream it, you can become it. But our faith teaches us to imagine and achieve, dream and become in the plural. We need to change those yous to y'alls. Right? We need to shift our vision to match the Bible's, not make the Bible fit our vision. Isaiah is a visionary prophet with a God-formed imagination. And so look again at his words to a people who despaired that things could ever be different from the way they were. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate, but you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married, for the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. Israel had returned from captivity in Babylon and found the land that was the promised land, the land of milk and honey, to be a very unpromising looking land of sour milk and of hardened honey. Right? Into that depressing city of Jerusalem, the prophet spoke a word of hope. God was with them, God was for them. That was the last thing they could see with their eyes of flesh. They needed eyes of faith to be able to see that their land could come to life again and be like a marriage of love and delight. The metaphor of a married land carries the idea of fruitfulness. God would have the last word on Israel. And speaking of marriage, look at the story of Jesus at the wedding feast in Cana. The father of the bride was on the brink of social embarrassment over the wine running out. But just then, Jesus' mother intercedes. Mary somehow knows there's another power at work here, and that her son can make all things new. So she advocates and agitates. And when Jesus finally acts, we are told that the guests marvel that the wine served last is better than the wine served first. See, history isn't inevitable. As Dr. King said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Things can be different, but they will be different mainly if we join with God and envision a new world and agitate for it the way Isaiah and Mary did. So imagine with me the American story. If our country from the first had a bias toward the last. By now we know that there's more than one origin story of America. One at Plymouth with the Pilgrims, the other Jamestown with enslaved people of African descent. It didn't all have to be the way it did. The Pilgrims, were not the elite of English society. You don't leave home in search of freedom and a better life if you're already at home enjoying a really good life. Those early settlers were Christians, but they weren't the landed gentry. They were from working class people on the fringes of society, and they were fueled by a vision of a new Jerusalem and a faith in the God of the last that came from texts like these. So what if our nation's forebears in Plymouth and Jamestown had taken up the Bible's bias toward the last? Think we would have needed a 1619 project to tell us a different view of our country from the point of view of the last? Speaking of what ifs, what if the church in the antebellum South hadn't read the Bible to justify slavery? What if John Broadus, one of the founders of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, had not defended, prayed for, and supported Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy in the name of protecting civilization, thus putting Baptists on the side of the oppressor from the beginning? What if, during Reconstruction after the Civil War, the church had supported 40 acres and a mule that would have given land and opportunity to freed slaves? What if in Dallas, Texas, a city which in the 1920s had 1 out of every 3 eligible white men as a member of the Ku Klux Klan, what if the church in Dallas had stood against white supremacy and demanded that our city be a home equally for everyone? What if our white city fathers had not made an accommodation with black pastors to keep the civil rights movement from bringing real and lasting change to our city, and instead traded it for a surface peace? Well, that was then, but this is now. And happily, we have the same chance in our day to make things right that we have always had. Today, we can reclaim the vision of Isaiah and rename the desolate lands in our city. Today, we can intercede with Jesus to bring out the best last. As Councilmember Thomas has shown us today, through the city's first real accounting of racial equity, decisions were made in this city in the past to cut off parts of Dallas from being fruitful. And those parts were neighborhoods populated by Black and Latino people. It's just the truth. Much of the land in southern and western Dallas is still unmarried, to use Isaiah's image. And it's unmarried because it was cordoned off by highways built deliberately to prevent encroachment of black neighborhoods into white. It is unmarried because of bank redlining policies that prevented black renters from getting mortgages, becoming homeowners, and building generational wealth. It is unmarried because all the landfills and dumps and toxin-producing businesses were permitted to be located there, something we would never allow to happen in our North Dallas neighborhoods. And it is unmarried because public transportation was not linked to schools and jobs and services, because public schools and public libraries and public parks and community centers and code enforcement and on were neglected. Even today, demography is destiny for too many in our city. Do you know that there is a difference in male life expectancy in Dallas, Texas, in a 2-mile stretch from 75215 in South Dallas to 75205 in Old East Dallas? The difference, 26 years. How can that be? Doesn't have to be. And this is the kind of thing leaders like Councilmember Thomas are working to reverse, because things are not fixed and final. Not in the spirit of Isaiah, and not if Mary still stirs among us. Not if the risen Christ is still loose in our midst, and he is. Our city leaders go to church, you know. And thank God they are seeing now what we are seeing now, which somehow once we did not see. But we're reading the Bible, and we're learning to read it as it was intended, with a bias toward the last. So just imagine with me the joy of God when all our neighborhoods know themselves as my delight is in you, and married. And when we taste the best wine together last. If we can imagine it, we can achieve it. If we can dream it, we can become it. Because that we is not just you and me. It is you and me and the God with a bias toward the last. Amen.